Thank you again for joining. For those who are returning, welcome back. For those who are new to this webinar series, we appreciate you joining for this session. A little bit about the series. The series is focused on providing professional development for researchers, students, practitioners, and others interested in the intersections between horticulture and international development. Webinars are scheduled every Thursday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time through September 19th. And for those who have been attending each of the webinars and plan to attend all 9, we will be offering certificates for those attendees. I'd like to take a moment just to introduce the organizing entity of these webinars. The Feed the Future Innovation Lab for Horticulture, or the Horticulture Innovation Lab, is a global research network that advances fruit and vegetable innovations, empowering smallholder farmers to earn more income while better nourishing our communities. We are based at the University of California, Davis, and have been funded by USAID for 10 years to conduct horticulture research, and currently have about 22 projects in 14 different countries across the globe. We decided to do this series because horticulture is a critical aspect of addressing malnutrition and obesity while also creating wealth, especially for women, youth, and other marginalized populations. Over the 9 webinars, including this one, we hope to pass along lessons we've learned and help build capacity in project management and promote the importance of fruit and vegetables globally. As I mentioned, my name is Kyle Friedman. I'm the host for this series and have interacted with many of you already and look forward to continue to do so across the 9 webinars. I'm a graduate researcher for the Horticulture Innovation Lab at UC Davis. I previously worked at RTI International, managing large donor-funded food security and agriculture projects. A few housekeeping items before I introduce our presenter and we get started. Participants are muted during the presentation. For any questions you may have, please feel free to submit those in the Q&A section of your Zoom control bar. For this presentation, if you have questions on a particular subject or slide, feel free to send those in and we can address them along the way. Otherwise, we'll have time at the end for questions. There will also be a brief survey at the end of the session. We greatly value your feedback, so please be sure to complete that. Our presenter today is Dr. Robb Davis. Robb is the Director of Intercultural Programs at UC Davis and has more than 25 years experience in international public health programming in more than 30 countries. He's designed training and master's level courses on project planning, monitoring and evaluation, and with a focus in in-depth interviewing techniques and participatory learning tools. Really excited about this presentation and to have Dr. Davis with us. So Dr. Davis, if you could just give us a little bit more of about your background and jump into your presentation.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me today. Yeah, as the bio Cal read, it said, makes clear, my field is public health, and that has spanned really community-based programming. So the type of work I think many of you are doing at the community level is the work that I've been doing, for these past 25 plus years, largely in French-speaking West Africa. And there, we were focusing on issues of basic child health, maternal and child health. Child nutrition was a big part of what I worked on. And then later in my career, got a lot more into infectious diseases, particularly malaria prevention and control. The unifying thing over all the years that I was working there was to try to develop programs that were based on learning from the community. So learning has a quantitative element. What are the proportions of proportion of malnutrition? What's the proportion of food insecurity in the community? But then more in-depth learning about causal factors, and that, in my view, requires mixed methods of learning, which brings us to today's topic, which is participatory learning via, and I'm going to make this case over and over, semi-structured interviewing. So the base of everything we're talking about today is really that semi-structured interviewing. I'm choosing to use, I will add one other thing about my career. So I did have the opportunity to work in a cross-disciplinary program for a number of years that brought together health programming along with microfinance. So working with microfinance agencies to engage communities and people in communities around health and nutrition topics. And again, all of these required mixed approaches to learning from and with the community about needs, about the impact of our programming. And so that's why the participatory learning for action, the piece of action here is whether it's program planning, project planning, monitoring, evaluation, these are not just static research methodologies. These are not just pure research methodologies. They're methodologies that have evolved over time to learn with communities. And I put that little via semi-structured interviewing at the bottom because really, and I'm going to contend, and we're going to mostly talk about semi-structured interviewing today. It's a skill that you build. Right? It's based on some basic, and you'll see principles of how to interview. But really, it's about the practice of learning and how you ask questions that unlock the key for people to explain their lives to you. So that's what we want to talk about today. Bottom line is, while we can talk about participatory tools, and we will, there are a series of tools that really help, engage people in discussions, community members, organizational members, whatever. You have to have a prior commitment to learning, right? So, and maybe for a lot of you this is obvious, but I think a lot of community development over the years has been driven by experts that come into communities, dispense wisdom and knowledge and understanding, and then kind of move on. And this approach basically says, well, people in their local environments, be it an urban or a rural context, know a lot more about their communities than we do, and so we have a sort of cultural humility. Whereas we bring expertise, whether it's in food security related issues or cropping, but we also, are bringing those ideas into contexts that we oftentimes know very little about, where there are power dynamics, where there are tenure arrangements, where there are, economic opportunities and constraints. And so participation is a commitment to learn about those things as we go forward to offer people opportunities to improve their lives. I'm putting this up. There will be a couple of slides like this that are pretty busy, and the point is not to go through them in detail. Next week, I think in your webinar, you're going to be talking about project management. And the only reason I put this slide up is in the red boxes. So this is a typical sort of linear way of thinking about program or project development: preparatory diagnosis, detailed implementation planning, implementation with monitoring, and then some form of summative or impact evaluation at the end. The point here is that all the way along, this process of planning and implementation and evaluation, we're using very similar tools to engage in learning, right? So we use key informant interviews, we use group-based tools, we use population-based quantitative surveys. And the red boxes here really get down to sort of the resources or skills that we need, right? We need, if we're going to do key informant interviews, we're going to do group-based participatory learning, then we need semi-structured and standardized interviewing techniques. We need to understand how to facilitate group learning. Now, I have no illusion that in 45 minutes this morning, I'm going to teach you everything you know about semi-structured interviewing. It's really about practice. It's really about getting some principles and then starting to try them out. And so I'm going to try to introduce the principles. But the point is, these principles and practices, are used all the way along a program or a project in different ways, whether it's initial sort of prospecting and understanding in order to design a more effective programming, whether it's monitoring, or whether it's some form of summative evaluation. So I see this as it was related to what's coming later in your webinar. So semi-structured interviewing, and I think this qualitative-quantitative distinction is a really useful one. We're talking today about qualitative learning methods, right? So these are methods that yield text. They yield the information we gather is not in a numerical form, but it might be, I'm typically text. More and more we're moving to mixed methods that bring in imagery, and we'll see how we actually use imagery in the participatory learning. But these tools are not designed to provide population-based estimates of incidents or central tendency of practices. Those are quantitative methods. You'll probably be learning and using them. Obviously, again, a lot of the work I've done, we were always estimating population parameters around food security levels, or for a long time in my career, on different ways of getting a population-based estimate of undernutrition, just as two examples, or uptake of services. We're not talking about those today. We're talking about the qualitative, and the qualitative and the quantitative are wed in my mind. I mean, these are not antithetical to one another, they're complementary. Because, I can learn, and here in my own county where I live now, I can tell you that approximately 30% of the people in this county where I live face some level of food insecurity, right? I can do that through a fairly simple interview, structured interview that yields an estimate of a population parameter. But what does that tell me about the causal factors? Very difficult to get at through a structured format. And so where we use qualitative interviewing and qualitative tools is to dig down and understand a little bit more of the dynamic causal factors. It's not meant to be a definitive proof. It's meant to provide rich descriptions and explore possibly descriptions of why things are happening. I just want to skip down to the column or the line that says tools approaches. And the only reason I'm pausing here for a moment is because, and you can look at this chart later, it's a fairly nice summary, I think. But the tools and approaches, I'm going to use the concept of semi-structured interviewing, and I'm going to distinguish that from unstructured. Unstructured is really almost just, I don't really have a plan. I'm just arriving in a place and I'm asking any question that pops into my mind. I don't have a structure. Standardized interviews, still qualitative. I want to make sure, maybe I have a research team, and I want to make sure we ask the same questions of everybody, but those questions are not closed questions, right? They're still open. They're still exploratory, but I want to make sure everybody asks the same ones. Semi-structured is somewhere in between. Semi-structured is, I have a guide, I have a series of topics that I want to cover. I may even have some prepared questions that I want to ask to launch the discussion, but I'm also going to let the interview to a certain extent dictate the direction that it goes. So I have a guide, but I'm not structuring this so that I have to go from question A to B to C to D. If in response someone jumps to question D, I don't go back and ask question D again. So there's a structure to it, but it's semi. Contrast that over on the quantitative side, we talk about structured interviews. Identical questions asked in exactly the same way with pre-coded responses so that we can, with rigor, estimate a parameter. Here, we're allowing the semi-structured nature of this to be generative of ideas, generative of themes that we can either explore in more depth or that stand on their own as explanations of the types of things we're trying to learn. So, I mean, if you have, we can, at the end or at some point come back and if you have questions about this, but I hope that this helps situate where we are today. We're squarely on the qualitative side and largely around how we use text and pictures to gain, to really, I think of it oftentimes as unlocking people's ability to explain their lives to us. How do I invite you in a non-threatening way to talk to me about the challenges, and hopes and difficulties you face in your life? And so that's really what we're doing with semi-structured interviewing. So we're going to try to talk about the things above the red line here today. Below the red line, we're not going to be able to get engaged in any practicing today as the format allows, but I have some ideas about how you might think about doing that. I want to talk about using open-ended questions. And again, some of this is going to seem fairly basic. It's the practice of it. And part of what I'm trying to do is put into your mind the parameters of how you think about interviewing so that as you start doing it, you're like, oh man, I need to think about open questions, or I need to think about avoiding leading questions. So we're going to talk about those two briefly. I want to spend a little bit more time on probes because I think probing is the key to successful interviewing. It's the key to successful interviewing. It's the way to help and invite people to give you more. It moves beyond a question to really questioning the answer to the question in a way that's non-threatening. We'll talk about letting the informant lead, and then a little bit on interview guides. So again, use open-ended questions. And closed questions, I know a lot of times you think, well, a closed question is a yes and no question, right? A closed question is one that just has an answer yes or no. That's true. But there are also closed questions. Closed questions are also questions that really imply a limited series of correct answers. Right? So anytime, if you're asking a question and you already know the answer, and there is only a limited number of answers, that's a closed question. We're typically not we're not testing people's knowledge. We're trying to encourage them to give us information. So what are 3 ways to prevent a cold? Well, that's a closed question because it implies to the listener, oh, there must only be 3. I have to find the correct 3. It's not inviting them to be open in their responses about how they understand colds. It's asking them to give certain correct answers. Or if you talk to people about your experience as a student at UC Davis, for example, that implies that there's only a yes or no answer. Now, again, oftentimes people will give us more when we ask simple yes and no questions, but a lot of times people will stop there. Yes, I talk to people about it, and you're stuck. So we want to avoid that. Here's another one that's very much a closed question. Do people here want more or less government intervention? Well, again, implies limited choices. Maybe what someone wants to tell you is, well, it depends. It depends. I mean, in some ways I want more, in some ways I want less, but by asking it that way, we're sort of closing off that possibility. So closed questions limit the breadth of information that a respondent has to offer, is asked to offer. So, if we're going to turn these into open questions, we might just say, talk to me about how you go about preventing a common cold. Talk to me about your experience and what you think is effective. If that's again, these are important things for us. I'm just pulling these examples because they're easy to understand. Instead of do you talk to people about your experience as a student, how do you talk to people about your experiences as a student? Who do you talk to? What are the things you talk about when you describe your experience as a student? Again, the type of question you ask depends on what you're trying to learn. But the point is, you're implying to the person that there's a broad array of ways you could answer this. Do people here want more or less government intervention? Talk to me about the way you feel about government intervention in your lives here. Help me understand places where government is intervening actively or not. And so we use these, we think about it. I mean, if you're an interviewer that's done a lot of more structured interviewing, it's a lot easier to really ask closed questions, implying that you're looking for a correct answer. We want to avoid that. I do have a little note at the bottom here about why. Obviously, words like what, where, who, when, how, or tell me more about, these are invitational words, right? They're inviting words. The why question is a challenging one. On the one hand, why is a very clearly an open question. It's not implying anything. But the problem with why questions is, why is a really hard thing to dig into. Think about your own life. You don't know why you do everything you do. And so, but people will give us an answer. And sometimes it closes off discussion to jump too quickly to the why. Let the interviewee lead you there and then maybe explore it more. Leading questions. So leading questions, if you watch newscasts from around the world, I don't care where you watch them on TV. Watch people who are interviewing the person in the street. Their questions are almost always leading questions, right? So a leading question suggests a particular answer without saying it. What do you like about the distance learning portion of the program, if you're in a distance learning program? Well, that implies that you actually like something about it. So TV interviewers, and I've done a lot of these in my life for a variety of reasons, they lead you down a path. What is it that most disturbs you about the political situation today? Well, maybe you're not particularly disturbed about the political situation, but you're being forced to go there. Why is the election process such a problem here? Leading question. Talk about some of the great parts of your academic program. Well, maybe you don't think there are any great parts. And again, if you translate these to communities, if you start asking leading questions, people will accommodate you by answering that question. Rarely is an interview, especially as you maybe don't have a close relationship with them, going to pause you and say, no, wait a second, you're asking the wrong question there. They're going to answer it, but you may be turning off the opportunity to learn. So what do you learn about the distance learning portion of this program? What do you like about it? Rather than that, you would say, talk to me about your experience with the distance learning portion. Why is it such a problem here, the election process? So describe what's going on in the election process here for me. Help me understand the election process. Then you can, and we'll get to it in a minute, probe and go deeper to understand what that's about. Your academic program at UC Davis or wherever, let's talk about how you're experiencing that academic program. Let's talk about, and you could even go to the point of saying, talk to me about some of the strengths and some of the weaknesses. I mean, as long as you're giving people an opportunity to speak to both sides of something, that may not be as leading. But again, you want to at least initially have questions that are not suggesting a right direction. If you're implying that there's a correct direction that you should be going, then it's a leading question. Again, observe TV interviewers, and you'll see leading question after leading question. Ask yourself, how could they have asked that question in a more open way, or a non-leading way, I should say. So now let's talk about probing, and I want to spend a few minutes on this because you're going to launch some questions. You're going to have some topics that you're going to ask about, and the foregoing had a few examples of types of questions. So, I may go in and start asking the question like, so people in this community are describing a situation where they often have to skip meals during the year. I'd like to talk to you about your family's experience with acquiring sufficient food. Talk to me about your family's experience in getting sufficient food or in getting food. That's a pretty big open question. And the person's going to give a response, some kind of response. And it's going to be revealing. Do you just leave that response on the table? Or do you use that response to push for more? And my experience is probing on what people have already said is the most powerful way of deepening your understanding. Because as you probe, you're helping the person, in a sense, birth a more complete description of what their experience is. So this is from Bernard way back in the 90s. Key successful interviewing is learning how to probe. That is, to stimulate an informant to produce more without injecting yourself so much into the interaction. So you're not trying to get them to tell you more about what you want them to say. You're trying to get them to tell you more about what they really think. And so the good news is we have some really powerful, and you'll look at these and you'll say, really, Rob? These are so simple, but they really work. These really, really work. And one of the reasons they work, a number of them really, really work, because what you're doing in a probe is oftentimes you're echoing or using the same terminology that the person used. What does that communicate to a person? When you use the same words or terms or ideas that they're using and probing on those words, you're telling them, I'm listening to you. I heard you say something there. That seems important. What you're saying is important. I want to know more about what you're saying. If we translate it into sort of pedagogy, you're showing respect for, the person. You're positioning them, you're moving away from you being the expert who's asking questions to them being the expert who's teaching you. And people want to teach you, right? People want to teach you about their community and their lives, typically, unless there's really, really severe conflict and people are fearful, which does happen. And then you have to probe maybe a little differently. But generally speaking, people want to be teachers. They want to help you understand. So an echo probe, and again, these are basic, but you have to think about using them. You have to build them into your practice. These are not automatic. And the reason they're not automatic is because we often think of interviews like a conversation with a friend. It's balanced. You talk a little, I talk a little. You tell me a story, I ask you some questions. We joke about it. That's not what an interview is. An interview is meant to be unbalanced. You say a little, they say a lot. They say something, you get them to expand on it. And so we don't often think about probing with our friends, right, in a friendly conversation, because it's got a natural flow. If we probe with our friends, they're going to start saying, "What are you doing? Were you pumping me for information? Why are you treating me this way? What am I, an interview subject?" So that's why they're not a normal part of the way we think about conversation. And interviews are conversations, but they're interviews. We're using them to deepen our understanding. So repeating the last thing that the respondent said with a slight rise or in your voice. So the person says, I think that the clinic here serves the community really well. Or I think there are problems with the clinic here. You think, You think there are problems with the clinic? And just that little inflection, just repeating back, the person is going to say, yeah, there are problems with the clinic. Here's what's going on, right? So they're going to start expounding on it. Re-question. So you've been talking about your experience with the clinic, or you've been talking about your experience, let's use an example from ag, of the, the ag extension worker. Tell me what else you think about the role of the ag extension worker in your community. What else do you think about? What else do you think about? And it's merely saying, I want to give you space to say more about that. You've already said something about the ag extension worker. Now tell me what else you think. Of course, then there's silence. And this is a really, really difficult one. Because I think we're afraid of silence. We think the person's going to get bored, or we're thinking that they think we don't know what we're talking about or don't know where to go next. But a lot of times when we ask questions, we've been spending a lot of time, right? We've thought about the questions we want to ask. We've thought about what we want to learn from a community. And so we know really the types of things we want to learn. And then we go and talk to people in the community, and we realize that no one's maybe ever asked them about that before. Like, I don't know, wow, no one's ever asked me that. And so sometimes people need time to even think about what they think. They need time to reflect on how they would respond. And so silence is offering people an opportunity to sort of collect an answer or a response. If we jump into that silence, people are not going to stop us. They're going to say, wait, give me a minute. I need to think about that. Some will, but the vast majority, especially if people give us a response and we jump into it, they're going to let us run with it, and they're not going to stop us. And so silence is very hard. It's a very powerful way. And silence, that means let things go out. Try 10 seconds. It feels like an eternity. 20 seconds can feel like even eternity squared or whatever, but you have to give time sometimes. A recap is a really interesting and useful probe, and it needs to be used carefully because it can communicate that you weren't listening. But a lot of times, the way this will work is, so someone will say, again, let me think of an example. My biggest concern about malaria is that I don't know if the fever that my child has is a fever caused by malaria or by something else. I don't know. I'm just picking that off the top of my head. And so the person may go on and say some more about that, and you may pick it all up. But you can often go back and say, all right, you said something earlier about the difference between fever for malaria and fever not. Could you repeat what you said about that? Now, the potential problem with a recap is that if it's used too much, people can say, well, are you not listening to me? Why are you asking me to repeat everything? But the power of the recap question is that people will never repeat themselves, right? People are not recording their answers in their brain and then replaying them. Each time that you ask someone to repeat, they will give you oftentimes completely new information that they didn't say before. It's amazing how that works. And then, of course, there are these encouragements, and these kind of go along with silence, but these are things that are somewhat culturally determined. Encouragements can be verbal probes, such as I see, I understand, thank you. Now, you don't want to be effusive, like, oh, that's great, yeah, that's exactly what I'm looking for, because that biases the respondent to say, oh, I'm going to give you more about that. What you want to say is, yeah, I see, I understand, thank you, I'm listening. The nonverbal, of smiles might be a click, which kind of is verbal, or a head shake, whatever direction you shake your head in a particular culture. Those things also are communicating as you go along. I'm with you. I'm still with you. I'm listening. I'm here. This is all I have to say about probes, and it fits on one slide. But I guarantee you, if you start thinking about these in your interviewing practice, I can't think of anything that's transformed the way I have engaged in semi-structured interviewing than really actively using these. And I use these. I do regular consulting. Now I've been doing recently a lot of consulting for boards, nonprofit boards, to discern some of the problems they have. And I always now insist before I do a seminar or facilitate a workshop that I interview board members, and I use these probes very actively as I do, and it really deepens my understanding of the processes of the board.
Can I jump in and ask you a question from the audience, Rob? So on the topic of probing, a question came through just asking how probing works when you're relying on a translator for interviews.
Yeah, very difficult, and I have done that. What I can say, I've had to do it a few times. What I can say is train your translator. The best thing you can do is to help your translator understand what probes are. So what that two things can happen. When they translate an answer back, you may have your own probe, or they may and I've seen this, I've had this happen, them say to you, hey, I think I'd like to probe on that with them. And so if your translator is understanding, they obviously you can use any of these and they can translate it back. One of the nice things about translation actually is there's built-in silence. While they're translating back to you, there's a little silence, and I found that to be something that's actually kind of useful. I don't like using translation, and yet sometimes I know it's unavoidable, but it's a little bit harder for them to maybe use an echo. But again, if you train them and you have this understanding with them, they may be able to say, hey, I'm gonna, like I had a guy who would say, hey Rob, I'm gonna probe on that. Is that okay? And I'd say yeah, and then he'd give me a longer response. So that's one answer I would give to that. Okay, let's move on then. Again, this is back to that list of principles, letting the informant lead. Here's what we're trying to do, right? We're trying to keep the conversation focused on a topic. So there are ways of bringing it back, but you also want the person responding to define the content. Right? So it's a balance. Like you clearly are, with a semi-structured interview, you're clearly bounding or putting boundaries or parameters around the interview. But within those parameters, you still want to engage in discovery and let the informant or the respondent define the direction of the discussion. So, get an informant, this is again Bernard, get an informant on a topic of interest and get out of the way. Let the informant provide information that he or she thinks is important. And again, letting the informant lead, a key way to do that is through probing, right? Probing, because it uses what they've already produced, invites them to continue leading. Again, you can, at any time in a semi-structured interview, you can say, I'd like to hear more about that, but I want to talk to you about something a little bit different, or I'd like to take the conversation in a slightly different way. But that's just fine, right? Because you do have an objective. Again, this is not an unstructured thing. So there are moments where you are going to invite the informant to stop. That's fine. And I don't think we should, again, slavishly say, well, this is only about getting them to talk, and if they want to keep talking, then I'm never going to stop them. No, look at your objectives, what you're trying to achieve, and at the same time, don't be in a rush to get in their way of talking, and certainly don't fill the spaces with your verbiage. Figure out ways to succinctly probe so you can move on. All right. How are we doing on time?
We're good.
Good. So now I'm going to just really quickly go through some types of interview questions. So we've talked about some principles. Let's talk about interview questions. And I'm going to give a disclaimer here. These come from Spradley a long time ago, and they are about ethnographic interviewing. Ethnographic interviews are really largely about language. So you're going to see a focus here on words and terms and language. And personally, I think that's important. A great way to learn about a local context is to make sure you understand the local language and how people use language, how people use words. So we have these three broad types of questions: descriptive questions, structural questions, and contrast questions. These questions in Spradley's world, and I found them very helpful in my own interviewing. And as you think about developing questions, these questions are largely about language, about words, about terms, about concepts, and digging into them. So really quickly, descriptive questions can be of these different types: grantor, describe a typical day, show me around, draw me a map, and this is where these grand tour questions come over into the participatory learning methods, because a lot of the participatory learning methods are these grand tour. Draw me a map, show me your community, describe a typical day here, describe what happened yesterday. Example questions are also descriptive. You mentioned, your community faces challenge in helping returning veterans, or I don't know, challenges in women's income generation. Can you give me some examples of what those challenges are? You used the word challenges. What are those challenges? You can see those are probes, but they can also be done in a second interview or in a later interview. Experience. Tell me your experience of trying to help homeless men in this community. This is an issue in my town. So experience questions. Talk to me about your personal experience. Don't just talk to me about the way things are here. Talk to me about your experience. Or Spradley called these native language questions. People use a term, and frankly, I was back in my home area. I don't live here. I didn't grow up in California. Recently, I was back in my home area, and I realized that people there were using English words, and I needed to make sure that sometimes I understood what those words meant. And so even in our own language, we may have native language questions, because across a geographical border, we may have words that mean slightly different things. And so ni hao is something I learned about in West Africa. Tell me more about how ni hao works. It's a word that is not my language, or is not a word that I use. But these descriptive questions are ways of sort of opening up and getting a general sort of start on a topic, whatever that topic might be. Structural questions are verification. So they're a little bit like these native language questions or example questions, but they're more focused on, you use this word loha, again, or use this word mambodayo. Some of you in East Africa, it's an interesting word I won't get into that I heard one time. You said that women are afraid to go out alone because of teasing. What are some ways you've seen teasing take place? What is teasing? And this came up in India. And teasing, even though the informant and I were both speaking English, teasing means something in American English and a very different thing in Indian English. So structural questions are to verify or to deepen our understanding of words that people are using. And then, of course, contrast questions are where we hear terms and we want to make sure we understand the difference. So when I interview, people that work in shelters here, this happened recently, people would say, hey, no, that guy over there, that's a newbie. We don't know him, or that's a hardcore homeless individual. Okay, so what are the differences between the hardcore homeless and the newbies? Like, what's happening? Well, yeah, a lot of the newbies here, they're just off the bus. A lot of them seem to have mental health problems that are going untreated. The hardcore homeless, we know them, they know the rules, they know how to act. The newbies don't know how to act. So again, these are contrasts because you're hearing terms and you're trying to make sure you're not assuming you know the difference between them. Earlier you said there's a second generation among immigrants, how they view violence differently than first generation. What's the difference between first generation and second generation immigrants in relation to that? So contrast questions, again, all of these, whether it's structural, to a certain extent even description, and structural and contrast are to deepen our understanding of words. And you can see how they fit really nicely into the idea of probing, right? Because they're based on words that people have told you, and you're deepening your understanding of those words. And again, I'm not necessarily contrasting hardcore and newbies because I think there's any contrast. I'm just reflecting back and saying, when you use those two terms, I'm not really sure I understand the difference between the two of those. Okay. I'm going to spend very little time on this, but I know a lot of your questions are probably going to be around, so how do I get started? Who do I interview? Those are questions that I wish we had more time to talk about. The bottom line is it's going to depend on the kind of information are you working primarily with women's groups? Are you working with like a student here at UC Davis this summer who's gone to Puerto Rico to talk to women that were involved in home, household and kitchen gardening? Okay, so that's probably the group you're going to be talking to. What questions do I ask? Well, what is it that you're trying to learn? I mean, again, can you think of a few questions that get the conversation started and then use probes? The point is, when you go into an interview, you're obviously going to have some help identifying people who will respond, maybe based on discussions with groups in the community or individuals you identify. But what you want to establish right away is, look, I'm a learner here. So don't start the interview immediately asking questions, especially very personal questions. Start the interview by positioning yourself with, you have information. I'm trying to learn about X. I'm trying to learn about kitchen gardening. I'm trying to learn about the impacts of the hurricane on kitchen gardening, which is what she was doing. Or I'm trying to learn about how irrigation rights are divvied up in this community, or the challenges you face with irrigation, whatever it might be. You're here to help me understand that. I have some questions, but I really want to learn from you and understand the situation here. So, express interest. This is not, again, these are not bullet questions and bullet answers. Remain neutral. But again, you want the balance to be, as I say at the bottom, 80% their words, and I would even say 90% their words, and not so many, your words. Again, we already talked about probing, and if you establish the conversation around the things you want to learn about, people will typically walk with you as you try to do that learning. Sometimes questions don't work. And one of the biggest challenges for interviewing is trying to figure out the right question. And the only advice I have there is try to rephrase it. Pause for a moment and even say, I want to ask you this question again. And I want to think about the way I want to ask it. Sometimes we just don't know how to formulate a question. Someone will say something and we'll not even be sure where to go. Don't be afraid to fail and to rethink and to rephrase and to reformulate. I'm going to move on from this. One thing that Kyle will have for you after the course, there'll be some readings after the webinar today, and this file will be in there. I use this every time I'm going into an interview, because what this does, what it is, it's a little job aid, if you will. It's a little guide that I use for myself that kind of takes all the things that I've been sharing with you up to now and puts them into this little checklist. So when I'm going in and preparing an interview, say with a board member, which I did recently, I use this up front to say, all right, I want to make sure that I'm reminding myself of the probes, I'm reminding myself of the types of questions that I'm going to ask, and it's just sort of a one-page summary of the different things that I want to think about. And if you are fortunate enough to have a colleague who can work together with you and you can build your interviewing skills together, I've used this with colleagues many, many times so that they could observe me and give me feedback. And you can also use this after an interview that you do to go back and assess yourself. Like, what did I do? How did I do? Did I use silence? How did I use it? So you'll have a copy of this guide, and I would encourage you to use it kind of as that summary sheet you can carry along with you as you're thinking about interviewing. We do use field guides, and there's no set way to develop a guide. And again, we're not using questionnaires, we're using guides. So the guide is there. You may want to develop, and I say 10 to 20. I think it's much less than that. It's actually 5 to 10, depending on the length of the interview. It should focus on what your topic is. You can develop some questions up front. The point is, don't feel you have to stick slavishly to them, and certainly don't feel you have to treat them in the order that you have them. Because if someone gives you something that is later in your guide, don't go back to it. So it's a starting point. It's a set of cues. It is not a structured survey. And guides are just that. They are guiding you. They're a way to start. They're a way to make sure that you don't forget something you want to ask. Experiment with a style that works for you. Today, I'm not going to talk about note-taking, and the reason I'm not is the technology is really changing. I never have ever, believe it or not, in all the years that I've been doing semi-structured interview, I've never used, except one time, I've never used a recorder. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Part of it was when you record an interview, then you have to transcribe it. And transcription used to be, before voice recognition, very, very time consuming. When I was coming up and we were learning about these things and practicing them, we were taught to take raw field notes and expand them immediately after the interview and then code them. Code them is just looking for patterns in data. This whole process of note-taking has changed. I'd be happy if any of you are interested in talking about technologies that are available, and all to get into it more. The bottom line is no matter how you end up with your notes, whether you took raw and expanded them, and the key is to do it immediately, or whether you transcribe them, you're going to want to put them into a format, especially if you're asking 5 or 6 people similar types of questions and looking for emerging patterns in the data. You're going to want to code them. And coding is really just a process of reading, rereading, rereading, and looking for patterns of responses, terms, phrases, so that you can begin to pull out not quantitative numbers, 10% of the people said this, but more a number of people, or a large number of people spoke about this. I saw a tendency to talk about this. And you're looking for those themes, if you will, that are emerging. I'm going to apologize for not saying more about that, but that's where the practice of this, I'd be happy to work with any of you individually if you want more information on that. Just quickly then, to sort of finish up. So now we finally get to participatory learning, which is ostensibly the title of this thing. But participatory learning approaches, and again, you'll have in the resources afterward a field guide, which is very, very grounded about how to start some of these tools, like how do you do a map, how do you do a problem tree, and some of you already know how to do it. But basically, participatory learning methods or participatory learning approaches are just really a set of qualitative learning approaches. They all rely on interviews, right? They all rely on the same interviewing principles and practices we talked about. But they have 4 twists, right? We typically think of a semi-structured interview as something we do with an individual. Participatory learning approaches, by design, typically are group-based. So we're talking to a group of people. Now you may say, well, Rob, what's the difference between PLA, participatory learning for action, and a focus group? Well, there are some differences, probably in practice. To me, both obviously want to use the power of a group. I do think that the participatory learning tools, probably more than some focus groups I've participated in, attempt to be interactive. In other words, what you want to do is you want to encourage the people to talk to each other, not to talk to you. So you're really deliberate about you yourself as the interviewer disappearing and having people converse with one another. The other difference I would say is I've been in a lot of focus groups where there's no visual, but with participatory learning approaches, we're actually trying to produce or use a visual to organize people's talking about something. And the visual is something maybe they created or something that we offer for them to analyze and talk about. So for example, I'll talk about in a minute, people can create a map of their community, or you can bring a satellite map of their community and ask them questions about it. But there's a visual. So we're not just looking at each other around the table, we're focusing on something. And I think what I've learned over time is by having these visuals, by having these things that we do, we're taking the attention away from me, the interviewer, and we're putting the attention on this thing that people are talking about. And it often frees people up to say things that they might not otherwise say. And that's really the 4th point, is there's often a kinesthetic element. We might be asking people to design or rank or sort things, make piles of things. A lot of times when I was using these in communities where there was no paper or pencil, we would draw things on the ground. And many examples I'm going to give you in a minute show that, where people would trace things and they would use stones to do ranking of things. A pile of stones indicating the relative importance, that type of thing. And there was a kinesthetic element to that. People were moving around and creating. The thing about participatory learning, at its best, it's not just about a lone interviewer talking to a group of people. It's a series of tools to learn about a community. So we think about not just having an agronomist, but having an agronomist maybe with an economist and someone with a background in community development. Maybe I want someone who is coming from sort of a gender studies perspective, along with someone who's working in health. Why do we do that? We want multidisciplinary teams so that the questioning around an activity and the way we're even thinking about crafting the questions can be informed more broadly. So traditionally, I have not used PLA as a lone interviewer. I've used it at least in a small team of 2 to 3 people so that we have these different perspectives on how we ask. We don't just use a single tool, we use a few tools. So we may do a map, but we may also do a transect walk through the community based on that map. So we're not just using a single approach to learning, we're using multiple. And then obviously we typically want diverse community perspectives. And when I say that, I don't just mean men and women, right? Some of the most fruitful things I've done with PLA have been younger people and older people. Obviously ethnic groups that differ in the community, power dynamics. I worked in an area in West Africa where there were a lot of patron-client relationships. The patrons wanted to dominate the discussion. The clients, we had to go and seek them out, and we had to figure out ways to get those diverse perspectives. So it's these four things, but it's also keeping in mind that we want to triangulate the information by coming at it from different learning perspectives, different community perspectives, and different tools. What are those tools? Now, let me just put them all up. And these are, again, I have a lot more information in the resource I'm giving you on PLA that I helped write with Karen Schoonmaker-Freudenberger many years ago. I still use it. I still find it very powerful. But we think of the tools as a variety. There are spatial things. Sometimes we just need to understand the spatial layout. And of course, in horticulture and agricultural work, space and how it's laid out and where people farm and who has rights to that land and all of those things can be represented on maps. And then walkabouts or transects, where we take a walk through the community and allow the community itself to define the questions that we ask. There is a whole domain which can be really rich, and I use a lot of social relational. We used to refer to these as Venn diagrams, sort of the overlapping social relationships. We will talk about them as social mapping. I'll give an example. But these are tools that are designed to say, what are the important relationships in this community? Who outside this community do you have relationships with, to what ends? Of course, in the work that you're doing, many times temporal or seasonal or timelines or histories can be really important. I know when I was working in Mauritania, and here in Yolo County, actually, where I live, some of the work that I do with farmers is talking about the historical practices of cropping on their farm and how with climate change and with changing international markets, things are changing over a longer period of time. Fascinating in communities. Timelines and seasonal calendars, of course, are much shorter in the now. Like how does your life change throughout the seasons of the year? Very interesting. Again, I'm going to give you an example really quick in a minute. Then there's all sorts of ranking activities, what people prefer, what they fear, what they want. We have matrices where it's kind of 2x2 ranking. It's not just ranking along a single classification. We have people sort ideas. I do a lot of pile sorting in classes that I teach to get people to prioritize, the learning that they want to engage in. And then a very powerful, and you use this in program planning, is cause and effect, or so-called problem trees and solution trees. Getting people to help you understand what they believe to be the causes of the challenges they face and the outcomes, right? So that's what a problem tree is. Let me just give you real quick examples. Are we still okay on time?
Yeah, keep going. We're doing great.
Okay. So here's, and I'm not asking you to study this. This is a map that we did in a community in Kenya a number of years ago. It was a really interesting one. We had people draw this on the cement floor of a church using chalk and sticks and different found images, and we then transposed it onto a sheet of paper. But there was a couple interesting things about this map. One is a group of community members, about 20 as I recall, helped us do it and drew the lines, and then we brought in a youth group and had them critique it and add to it, and we sort of interviewed the map, and we asked them to talk more about how their experience of the community. And then the third step we did is we used this map to walk the community. And you can't tell it from here, but this, across the top, where the arrows are, that's about 6 kilometers. And so, we walked most of this. I'm not going to get into the whole thing about it, but again, in terms of learning, if we had done nothing else in this community, and we wanted to talk about food security here. We were doing some work on food security in this area. But if we learned nothing else, that vertical line kind of on the third quarter left that goes up and down, that taught us a lot about this community. As you see everything to the right of it, you see all those kind of squiggly lines. That's a series of irrigation canals that were enabling people, and they came out of naturally occurring springs, and they would flow down to that part. People on the right side, who were traditional landholders in this area, they had access to water almost year round, and they were engaging in fairly lucrative truck farming, gardening, selling produce. The people on the grid more on the left, they were also farmers, but there was no water supply. So they were seasonal, basically corn. They were newcomers, migrants to the community from another area, and there was a real social distinction between these two parts of the community. There was conflict between these two parts of the community that we were able to pick up on just by doing a map, and then of course by walking it. So walking a map, getting other people to, after a map is produced, to talk about the map. I've done, I don't know, scores of maps in communities all over the world, and it's amazing to me how people love to use maps to tell you their community. And I wish I had more time to tell you stories. This is a Venn. Now, it's not really a Venn. And again, this was done on the ground with different symbols. This is the shocking one, because what we did is, all we did is we drew a circle on the ground. This was in a community, a very rural community, about 600 kilometers from the capital city of Nouakchott in the edge of the desert in Mauritania. You arrive in this community of about 400 people and you say, it's isolated. The fascinating thing was this. So we said to them, here's the circle. Let's talk about inside the community. What are the people, places, and events inside this community that are important for the community? And everything flowed back to the community council, and then all the things that people were doing. And the council determined field allocation. They determined collections for charity. And so you can see that, and the village chief was a very powerful guy here. You can see that here, everything kind of, there were connections within the village, but a lot of things flowed back to this kind of male Jem'ah that made a lot of determinations. But what was most fascinating about this was the outside. And what they started doing is they started listing, after we were done talking about the inside, all the people, places, organizations that are important outside. And immediately, as they started putting down stones to represent them, they would specify the type of relationship without any prompting. So they would say things like, this is a political relationship only, or we exchange with them economically. Well, historically we did, we were linked to them, but we don't do much with them now. Oh, that is as a blood relationship. That's part of, they're part of us. And so you had this very fine representation. And most fascinating to me was, here's this, again, this very isolated community. And they had migrants from this community all over the Gulf, that is the Persian Gulf. And so it was a significant source of income to that community. You walk in there and you say, there's nothing. They're completely isolated. And yet they were connected all over the place in very, very specific ways that helped them survive in a very, very challenging ecological zone. That was learned just by asking simple questions about relationships. I've done similar, for those of you in health, if any of you are, I've done similar diagrams where I've gone into communities and said, talk to me about all the people, places, and events that have some connection to the health of this community. And again, in very small communities where there may be one clinic or no clinic, it's amazing to me how you come up with 10, 15, 20 different sources of care, specialists who specialize in very, very specific things, or rituals that people do to try to influence health that are a part of the way they think about health. And so it expands your understanding of health, where if you just went in and started asking questions about the clinic, you wouldn't get that. Oh boy, temporal, seasonal. So again, on the left side of this diagram, in this particular area, we basically learned, that people really divide the year into 4. There's this extended dry season. This again is in the Sahel. There's this spring. That's a very spring. Is this period when things start changing. Basically, it's a transitional. And then there's a period where it's really cold, and then you have the rainy period. And what we use this for, and this is a summary of about 5 different activities where we talked about things like when debt is the worst, when male labor is the highest, when female labor is the highest, when migration out of the community is the greatest. And we brought it all together, but in this diagram, just to summarize it, but this again was a fascinating one because we brought some of the women's work to the men, and the men actually were discovering things in their community that they hadn't acknowledged before. So, and again, in the Sahel, this helped people really articulate the challenges of the dry season. when there just isn't quite enough to get through, and also, when the stresses on the community are highest. So that's an example of a temporal. Did lots of stuff on preferential ranking. We had, in this particular place in Kenya, we had a group of women lay out, just kind of name all these different illnesses. And again, they illustrated them with simple drawings or figures on the ground, these different illnesses in children. And then we had them rank them with stones in terms of the ones they were most afraid of, the ones that were most frequent to them, and then the most costly to treat. And again, we were trying to understand, what were the health priorities there. And so we ranked in 3 different ways, kind of a matrix of seeing, along these different lines. And the first step was actually, generating the list of concerns, of health concerns that people had. And don't get too hung up on the words. We weren't always sure what people were saying. We had to probe a lot to find out these were not said in English, but we were able to, again, through translation, to get a pretty good determination of what everything was. Healthcare matrix, again, in a totally different community. Again, this is transposed from something that was done on the ground. We named some concerns, some diseases that were of concern, and then just having done a Venn diagram, we just talked through, where they're most likely to be treated, and got people to talk about why they use some or not the others. That's a matrix example. This cause and effect tree, I put this one here last because for me, this was, just in my own experience, this is kind of a life-changing event for me. We had spent about 5 days in this community talking about all sorts of things related to food security. This very remote area, again, in Mauritania, where people were farmers, but also did a lot of labor. And so they kept talking to us about Livleka. This is the season of the year when, you just can't make the ends come together, as it were. Like, you just can't join ends, right? And so they kept talking about that. And, Livleka was really the hard time. And so we finally one day just plopped a rock on the ground and said, all right, this is what we understand. There's a season of the year when you lack food. It lasts about 2 months. Here's the way we understand it. Either you don't have enough money to buy food, or you're not producing enough food. That's how we understand it. So help us understand what's causing all of that. That was fascinating, and maybe you would say nothing really real, but what it came down to is how much time during the hungry season they were out gathering food, for example. They talked a lot about things they had tried, like raising chicken, like cattle. They didn't have enough money to buy cattle, but they got cattle loaned to them. But they spent a lot of times talking about the causes of why those things were never quite sufficient. Gardening, they had a well at one point that collapsed. That led to it. So they were giving us the causal mechanisms for inadequate food production and lack of revenue. They had labor. The problem was labor had to go 100, 200, and 300 kilometers away to find work. They had tried handcrafts, selling them to generate. But what was fascinating here was when they started talking about the effects, right? So the problem of indebtedness, the problem of they had to go out and beg. They go into communities into the more urban areas and beg, and how demeaning this was. Dependency on others, how it led to dependency on other groups that then use them for political ends. And so the effects of these things and illness, and a big problem in this area is just simple migration out of the community. So we asked basically 2 questions, or made 2 statements, and basically for an hour, community members came forward and told us different things about the cause and effects. And it was the women in the group at that particular day who talked about migration from the village, because it was largely men. These are very powerful things, right? And again, there's an element of launching a question. There's an element, obviously, in any of these of probing. Tell me more about that relationship. Talk to me more about indebtedness. There's so many things that you can probe on. In fact, the problem here is not information. The problem here is too much information. So much comes out in a group that you really do need a few people taking down the notes, and that's why a group-based approach is also helpful. I think that's where I'm going to stop. You might, again, say, all right, so Rob, you went over maps and you went over ranking and all that. How do I actually do it? I'm hoping that the manual that you'll have as a resource will, because what we try to do is walk through like kind of how to do it, some of the things to think about. And so Again, I'm happy to follow up with any of you if you have questions via email here. I would prefer you text me at that number if you can, if you want to ask me questions, and then we'll set up some sort of Zoom or something so we can discuss it more. I am happy to come in, not through the Horticulture program, but personally I have a Zoom account. I can Zoom with you if you want to get into any of these more. And then the other thing that's going to be in your resources is just where did all this PLA come from? And it goes back to the 80s when people were in agro-ecosystem analysis and farming systems, trying to be a little bit more humble about how they approach farmers to say, okay, you're the ones surviving in these marginal climates, how do you do it? As opposed to saying, we have the solutions. So there are going to be 3 articles by a man named Robert Chambers that I recommend to you. They're somewhat dated, but I still think they hold up very well.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rob, for the fascinating presentation, and really timely given that last week we covered value chain assessments and talked about a little bit key informant interviews, and so how this kind of provides everyone with the right approaches and things to think about when they're going through that in their research and their project activities. So feel free for the participants to continue to send questions along. We have a couple that came through, and I have a couple just to get us going. So we've talked a little bit about, or a lot about, the different types of questions and the dynamics when interviewing and things to think about. Can you talk a little bit about the environment in which these interviews and discussions take place? So even before, you know, the questioning and discussion begins, like, is it important to think about the environment in which you're having these discussions, and maybe how does that play into the conversation?
Yeah, that's a really important question, and I would say I answered a little bit differently. So there's some general principles. I mean, if you're going into a community to do learning, I mean, I think in any context, if it's an urban setting, obviously it's different than a rural, but you know, identifying key informants is always a challenge. And you know, in the work that I've done, I have never done any of this type of work as merely an outsider coming in. So this is all based on partnership with people that have some relationships or some connections. Semi-structured interviewing and participatory learning, I think it's very difficult to start or to make happen if there's absolutely no relationship. And part of it is because you're asking for people's time, and you're asking possibly questions that are challenging at times or sensitive to ask. Now you may say, well, what do you mean by relationship? And it doesn't need to be a direct relationship. I often use referrals. When I'm working for organizations, I'll have someone do an introduction. When we go in to do PLA activities, we'll often sit with community leaders and describe what we're going to do. For semi-structured interviewing, that is key informant interviewing, I really think it's important to try to arrange a situation where, you know, you're away from an area of distraction. So you are asking someone for a time commitment, but try to move them into another room or out into a space where, you know, they're not going to be distracted, right? Or where other people are going to hear them and more sensitive to topic. For the participatory learning tools, this is a much more, I would say, logistical challenge that requires negotiation. So, you know, when is a good time of day to meet with a group of women? You know, figure that out. Or when is a good season, depending on certain places. And to specify, we'd like to do a map with a group of community members, and then we'd like to talk to some youth. It really needs to be, it takes some logistical juggling to make that happen. And the way I would often do it is to sort of establish, hey, we're going to be in or around this community for a few days. And so we're going to do a series of things and talk to you when are the best times to do that. Obviously with PLA, if you want to specify a group, so when we were in Afghanistan doing these, and we were in a conflict zone, and we wanted to interview women about the conflict, we needed to create a safe space for them. And I wasn't there even as a man. I had women who were working with me on the team. When we were in places like Mauritania, where there were these power dynamics, we had to explicitly, we had even methods for doing it where we would ask powerful members of the community who we were concerned were going to bias the interview. We would actually designate a team member to go off and do a transit walk with them away so that we could talk to other people in the community. So these things have to be thought about. For individual semi-structured interviewing, you want to identify, the type of person you want to interview, determine the number of people so you get the broader picture, and then be respectful of their time, tell them how much time you need, practice your interview a little bit before you go, and then move them into a situation where it's quiet and they have time to think. So that's what I would offer for that.
Awesome. That's helpful. Back to probing, I know that was kind of a popular topic, and it's a really useful kind of tactic in this kind of approach. Is there ever too much probing that can happen, or maybe how can you determine if a informant is uncomfortable with the level of probing, or if it's just too much, if you've had experience with that?
Yeah, that's another, I think, really helpful question. Look, there are some informants, for whatever reason, and it may be that they just have too many things on their mind, or they maybe just aren't able to articulate their thoughts. They're not, they're very perfunctory in their answers. And so the first tendency and the correct tendency is to try to probe as much as you can. But there are times, and I've actually been recently using these for a variety of purposes, where you just say, that's probably all I'm going to get out of this person. Multiplying the probes is not leading to anything, and it's coming across as badgering, and so sometimes it just doesn't work. And I don't always fully understand why, and I'm sorry if I can't say more about that. I think generally speaking, probing, even if it's not a lot more, will deepen the conversation. And so, and sometimes what I found is I'll start an interview with someone and they seem really reticent and they seem like they don't want to talk. And lo and behold, we'll get to a topic that they're passionate about. And that's what they really want to talk about. And then I don't even have to probe. Then it's just a matter of really just listening. So I think patience is important. But if you find yourself just saying, I'm asking the same question over and over again, or I'm just repeating and they're not giving me more, I think it's fair game to say, maybe I'm not going to get any more from this person. It's okay. It doesn't always work. It doesn't always work.
Right.
Just like when you do a structured interview, if you do phone interviews or some of you do door-to-door interviews, people say, no, not going to answer. Well, that happens here too. So it's not a failure. It just means that you try to find someone that can help you understand.
Awesome. Talking about the visual tools that you shared, I think was really great, and something that's slightly new to me. I think commonly in this kind of interviewing, people are very used to sticking to questions and maybe not utilizing those kinds of tools. And so can you talk a little bit about maybe how you determine if you should use visuals within these kinds of discussions and interviews? Or if you recommend they always be used, and just.
So, when I first started using participatory tools, one of the reasons we were using them and having people design things is because we were operating in environments where there were large flipboards and whiteboards and sheets of paper.
Right.
And so we wanted people, and we were often dealing with people who were illiterate. And what we wanted to communicate was, you have knowledge and information you can show us. And so the visual in that, I always thought that was the key. We needed visuals because it gave people encouragement to speak. But I didn't state this up front. I was an elected official in Davis here in the city. And we ran many, many public workshops around land use issues, around transportation planning. We ran them on citing of, you believe it or not, marijuana and cannabis distribution, because we sell that now. We used visuals, and we used maps a lot, and we used ranking a lot. And what I discovered there is it enables many more people to get involved. You really are taking the focus off of the interviewer, and you're focusing on this kind of maybe depersonalized things that really enables people to talk. The other thing is the power of visuals, and why I like them so much, And why, when I came into city government, I really insisted that we start facilitating our public outreach with a lot more visuals and a lot more visual engagement, is because no one owns that visual. We all own it, right? If I'm taking notes, I'm kind of owning the information. It's in my hands, right? But a picture, a drawing, a diagram, a ranking, that's ours. You can dispute it, you can add to it, you can cross things out. I could give you example after example of where, we had people ranking things in community, and someone would come up, we do it with piles of stones, and someone would come up and kick the pile of stones and say, no. Well, that was disrespectful maybe, but they felt passionately. What are they trying to say? Why are they trying to be involved? And so it's a different type of ownership of information. And I think that's what's so powerful about the visual tools. Whether you're dealing with illiterate community members in some rural area of the world, or whether you're dealing with highly educated PhDs in a city like Davis, that you would say, well, that seems childish to them. No,
right.
It isn't. We're drawn to visuals, we're drawn to the interaction, and people participate in it.
Great. Switching gears to, I know we talked a little bit about coding, and I know we don't have significant time to really get into that.
Yeah.
But one question that came through is just there's a number of, I guess, third-party qualitative labs or groups that may help with transcription and coding. Do you find there's a benefit to have someone removed from the actual collection of data and doing the interviewing, do that kind of analysis, or do you think it's best to kind of keep that within?
So I think there's two things here. I think it's, and there are, the online tools that I use now, a program called Deduce. It still requires you to enter the data, if you will, the text.
Mm-hmm. So
I think the transcription or the entering of the textual information by third party is great. I want to at least have a chance to code all my own data. In other words, if I'm part of a team that's generated it, so a lot of times we'll work in teams and do interviews. I want all of us to go through all of the data, the textual data, and all of us do our own coding and then bring it together. So in other words, I want the person who has a stake in the learning, whether I'm working alone or whether I'm working with a group, I want to look at that data myself. Whether I generated it, I say generated, whether it was an interview I did or someone else did. So third party, definitely, but really the analysis and the search for themes and the coding and the key terms that are surfacing, I want people that are primarily responsible for identifying and interpreting those to have a role in that.
Right.
And I don't think there's any way around that. Just like you've got to spend time on data analysis using crosstabs or regression analysis or visual display of data for quantitative, I think it's incumbent upon all of us who are in this work to really sit with our data. And the way you sit with your textual data is you read it, you walk away from it, you read it again, you come back, you do give it to someone else who understands the theme, you get them to read it, you get them to identify, and that's how you begin to, lift out, sort of key learnings across several informants. And it does reveal something else. I really do question the value of like single key informant interviews, not just for the reason of bias, but one of the things about qualitative interviewing is we do want to look for commonalities, but there's also power in the outlier. Like outliers sometimes say things that are really, really critical to understanding something. Outlier meaning they're the only one that said it, or they said it in quite a different way, or they disagreed. Well, I mean, with just one person, you don't know what you have.
Yeah.
You have the central tendency to have the outlier. Right. So I think thinking through, how many people on a given topic you want to talk to, there's no magic number. I know when I was doing the evaluation of a program about 4 years ago, I had about 80 students that had gone through this. I think I ended up interviewing about 10 or 15 of them, and really was able to find some emerging themes across all of them and some really interesting distinctions.
Great. In terms of the kind of demographics of discussion groups and ensuring that you get kind of diverse perspectives, how do you handle situations where there might be youth or women that might be not as encouraged to speak and kind of voice their opinions?
Right, and I'll go back to what I said. So, if you remember the, oh, sorry, if you remember the, this triangle, I think certain tasks is kind of interesting to do maybe with a mixed group mapping. I think there are other things, especially if you want to deepen your understanding of relationships or conflict or specifically like women's roles, for example, where you have to logistically structure opportunities to work with those groups alone. And again, I'll go to the Afghanistan case because it was really interesting. It is, you know, Afghanistan is a place where mixing of men and women, especially in some of the rural areas, is not done. And almost all the activities we did there were separate. And we had women's teams and we had men's teams. So we had to establish and make sure we had the right people in terms of language, and in that case, gender identity, to sit with those women. But there's no, if you're finding there are underrepresented groups, which there typically are in a community, then the tricky part is how you talk about it. You know, I want to talk to the poor people here. But there are typically ways of saying, you know, we want to talk to some of the laborers in this community, or we want to talk to some of the landholders in this community, or we'd like to talk about, we talk with leaders, or we'd like to talk about with people who are not in the leadership. You know, you might have to frame it to get your group, but you have to name your group. You have to name who it is you feel is not being heard, or whose voice you want to make sure does get heard. And the way I would describe it to community members, and you know, just to put people at ease, is, you know, we would take some symbol, like some complex symbol, and put it when we first go into a community, especially with leaders who'd be suspicious. And we say, all right, you're all sitting around the circle here. What do you see? And they'll say, well, I see this object. No, what do you see of that object? And they would talk about, obviously, the part that was facing them. And we'd say, and that's kind of what we're going to do here. We're going to look at this community, but we're going to look at it from a lot of different places. You, as a leader, you see it one way. Maybe the women over in this community or the laborers see it a different way. We want to hear them. And so when you use imagery like that to say the whole point is that everybody sees things from a different perspective, then there's no problem. Yeah, go ahead. We get it. And we never had a single problem, even in areas where there was pretty significant internal community conflict.
And we have a couple questions that came through on data collection, either in areas that maybe have had more saturation of data collection, so the community members might be more used to having those kinds of discussion groups, and then maybe if you're starting in an area that's new. So, and I don't know if you have examples of this, but in cases where, you know, interviews are taking place in a community that has kind of interacted with a lot of different organizations and done different focus groups or PLA, is there any techniques for, I guess, you know, starting out those interviews with members that might feel like they've kind of continuously participated in those kinds of discussions? And then the second question is kind of the opposite. If you're in a new area and people maybe aren't used to that, you know, how do you get that started? Do visuals help engage people that might be new to the process?
Yeah. So I just have to be frank about it. I have not, because of the types of things, either when I was in local government or when I was doing work in different areas around the world, I was working so often in rural areas, and here in the city I was working in topical areas that, you know, we hadn't done a lot of community exploration around, that I can't really respond to the first one where there's been a saturation. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure what I say about that, because I'm not actually sure what the dynamic would be. Mm-hmm. You know, whether it's seeking out people who are part of the community but have not been included, looking for new, different voices, I don't know. What I have experienced a lot is going into places where it's like, what? Mm-hmm. You're coming here to do what? You want to ask it? And a very common response that I received, and even again among uneducated people, is, well, you're the experts on this. Why don't you just tell us? And so it's a matter of starting by positioning yourself as a learner. And there's a couple really, really important things. whether it's individual interviewing, whether it's group-based interviewing again, in an area where you have uneducated people who may not see that they have anything to offer, or in an area where you have educated people who are saying, hey, we came to this session to hear you tell us something about, land use, is that you create initial interviews or activities, PLA, that really show people that they have something of importance to say. And that's why I would often start with a map. We go into communities, happened to me many, many times where I go into communities and people would say, all right, we understand you're here to learn, but we don't know anything. We're ignorant. I mean, look at us, we're just poor people here. And when you do a map and say, well, you're going to teach us about your community, show us a map, all of a sudden people are like, yeah, that is something we know. We know our community. Or in the community of Davis, when you say, I'd like to start an activity by having you reflect on your biggest concerns about the way land use has gone forward. What you're doing is you're saying, I want to start with your personal valued information, share that around the table, we'll hear that. And all of a sudden people are saying, oh, actually, my voice does really matter in this. It's just not a matter of me listening to an expert, it's a matter of me combining what I think with what they think. So you want to give people fairly early on a clear example of what they know and how easy it is for them to give you that information quickly. It's in pedagogy, we talk about it as an inference task. Sorry, that's not the right word. Can't think of it right now, but it's a task right out of the gate that says to someone, I value your knowledge. You have knowledge and I value it. And I guarantee if you position yourself that way, I've run into very, very few situations in using these tools where if you position yourself as right out of the gate saying to someone, you have something that I can benefit from, they'll give that to you. And then that opens the door to more and more, sort of learning. So that's been my bigger experience. The preparation for all of that, if you're going into a new area, that's where, again, the relationships, getting introductions, maybe going in ahead of time, talking about what you're going to do, making sure there's kind of general buy-in, so that when you show up, you just haven't arrived out of the blue and start doing things. So some preparation I think is necessary. And when I do it in the case of the city of Davis, it's preparation through sending out announcements about objectives we'll be accomplishing and the way the room will be structured. If it's in a community, it's going in ahead of time to meet with leaders and talk about what it is we're going to try to do. Don't be in too much of a hurry.
Yeah.
You can't be in too much of a hurry.
Right. Perfect. Well, we're about out of time. I guess just last piece of maybe clarification from you on terminology is if there's a distinction between participatory research methods and participatory research actions. If you could just clarify that.
Well, I mean, yeah, the clarification I would make is what you do with the information. So I believe that if you read the Chambers articles, what he calls participatory role appraisal, I believe what you'll find there is that when these methods that I talked about were being developed, they were always being developed with the purpose of doing some sort of community analysis and planning with the community.
Right.
He will talk, I think, in the articles about being extractive. So you can use participatory methods for a PhD thesis and extract information from communities and take it away and learn a lot. I don't personally feel that that's why the tools were developed. I feel that they were developed to enable dialogue about bringing change to a community. So the action part is saying to a community with legitimacy or individuals, I'm not coming to just get information for my purposes. I'm coming so that we can continue a process of working together. That's a really important distinction.
Perfect. Thank you for clarifying that. And thank you again for your presentation. Thank you to all the participants who have joined again from various countries and time zones. We really appreciate those who have come back for a second or third time and those who are new to our series. A couple of quick reminders before we close. You'll receive a brief survey at the end of this presentation. Please take a moment to complete that. We'd appreciate your feedback. Also a reminder, we have posted the first 2 webinars and the recordings and related resources on the website. I've posted that link in the chat. So if you want to access any of those resources or go back and listen to some of the recordings, we have those available for you. And we will post this recording by next week's webinar, which brings me to the reminder that next week's webinar on Thursday, August 15th, is on how to apply best practices in project management. That's a really key topic as a part of this series, and one that I know a lot of you are engaged with. And so we have some great information that will come from that. Thank you again for joining, and we look forward to speaking with you all next week. Take care.